The pharaohs were not the beginning. They were not the first rulers of Egypt. They were not even the first to shape it. When the pharaohs appear in history, Egypt already exists. The land is organized, the symbols are ready, the gods are already watching, which means something came before. Someone lived here, built here, believed here, and then disappeared. No names, no stories, no monuments claiming glory, only traces. And traces are the most dangerous things in history because they raise questions. Long before crowns, before dynasties, before pyramids, people lived along the Nile, not scattered tribes, not simple farmers, but organized communities. They buried their dead with care. They used symbols. They traded across long distances. They followed rituals. This period has a name, Pre-dynastic Egypt. But that name hides the truth, because pre-dynastic sounds unfinished. What we actually see is preparation. Before Egypt had pharaohs, before crowns and dynasties, communities lived along the Nile. Today, historians call this period the Naqada culture. It existed thousands of years before the first recorded kings. These were not isolated groups simply trying to survive. Archaeological evidence shows organized settlements, skilled craftsmanship, and long-distance trade. Naqada people produced pottery that went beyond basic function. The designs were intentional, repeated, symbolic. This suggests a shared identity and a common cultural language. Stone palettes from this period are especially important. They were originally used for daily purposes, but many were carefully carved with animals and symbolic scenes. These images appear again later in dynastic Egyptian art. This doesn't mean direct continuity in every case, but it suggests that some ideas were already forming before Egypt became a unified state. Burial practices offer another clue. Naqada graves often contain objects placed beside the body, tools, personal items, sometimes decorative pieces. This shows early beliefs about death and possibly the afterlife, not in the later Egyptian form, but as an early foundation. Trade networks also expanded during this time. Materials from Nubia, the Eastern Desert, and surrounding regions have been found at Naqada sites. This required planning, cooperation, and stable social structures. The Naqada culture did not exist in isolation. It was part of a wider world connected by movement and exchange. One of the most striking features of this period is the absence of writing. There are no texts explaining who ruled or how power was organized. This does not mean leadership did not exist. It means authority may have been expressed through tradition, ritual, and shared symbols, rather than written law. As the Naqada period progresses, the archaeological record begins to change. Symbols of power become more visible. Images of dominance appear more frequently. Social differences become clearer. By the late Naqada phase, many of the elements associated with early Egyptian kingship are already present. When the first pharaohs appear, they do not emerge from nothing. They rise from a society that had been developing for generations. The Naqada people were not forgotten. They became part of what followed. And understanding them helps explain how Egypt was ready for kings long before kings were named. When we look at Egypt today, it is easy to forget something important. The desert was not always a desert. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was green, not slightly green, not briefly green, but alive. Lakes existed where sand is now. Rivers flowed where nothing flows today. Grasslands supported animals, and people lived there. Archaeologists have found rock art deep in the Sahara, paintings of cattle, hunters, daily life. These images tell us something simple but powerful. People once thrived in places we now consider impossible, but climates change, slowly at first, then suddenly. Rainfall declined, lakes dried, grasslands disappeared, and when the land could no longer support life, people had to move. Not in a single wave, not in panic, but over generations, toward water, toward stability, toward the Nile. This movement matters because people don't travel empty-handed. They carry knowledge, they carry beliefs, they carry habits and traditions. And when many groups move toward the same place, something begins to happen. Ideas mix, practices merge, different ways of living are forced to coexist. The Nile Valley became more than a river. It became a meeting point, a place where cultures overlapped. Some groups farmed, others herded animals. Some followed rituals shaped by the desert, others by the river. None of this is recorded in writing, but it is recorded in patterns. Shared symbols begin to appear, common burial practices spread, art styles slowly align. This does not mean everyone agreed, it means people adapted, and adaptation creates structure. Here is the important question. When Egypt begins to look unified, is that because a king suddenly imposed order, or because generations of people had already been learning how to live together? The idea of Egypt may not have been born in a palace. It may have been shaped by movement, by loss, by people leaving old lands behind and building something new along the Nile. This would explain something historians struggle with: why early Egypt feels so ready, why beliefs appear shared, why symbols feel familiar across regions, why unification happens so quickly. Not because it was sudden, but because it had been rehearsed for centuries. And yet, much of this story remains invisible because migration does not leave monuments. People do not carve stone to remember leaving home. They remember it by surviving, by rebuilding, by passing stories forward. If Egypt inherited anything, it may not have been a single lost civilization. It may have inherited many memories, blended into one. And that raises a final question. When the pharaohs later claimed to rule all of Egypt, were they creating unity, or were they stepping into a unity that already existed? Heavier, carved with scenes. This shift tells us something important. Objects can change purpose before societies change structure. Symbolism evolves first. Power follows later. Some symbols appear connected to territory: animals arranged in processions, standards raised above groups, figures larger than others. These images do not say king, but they do suggest hierarchy, order, control. What is fascinating is how consistent these symbols become across regions, across generations. That consistency is not imposed by rulers, because rulers do not exist yet. It is imposed by shared understanding, a cultural agreement. By the time the first pharaoh appears, many symbols are already familiar: the crown, the scepter, the posture of authority. They feel established. That is because they are. Pharaohs did not invent symbolic power. They inherited it. They refined it. They claimed it. This changes how we see Egyptian kingship. Instead of creating meaning, the pharaoh becomes its guardian, its interpreter, its owner. And that raises a quiet but powerful question. If symbols shaped authority before rulers existed, then what truly came first in Egypt? Power or belief? At some point, symbols stop being shared, and start being claimed. This shift does not happen overnight. There is no announcement, no single moment, but slowly, certain symbols begin to appear in fewer hands. A falcon placed above one figure, a standard carried by one group, a crown worn by one individual. Meaning narrows, and when meaning narrows, power concentrates. Archaeology shows this change. Some images grow larger, some figures dominate the scene, others become smaller, not erased, just placed below. This is how authority is learned, not through force at first, but through repetition. When people see the same symbols attached to the same individuals, they begin to expect leadership. They begin to accept it. By the late pre-dynastic period, symbols are no longer neutral. They signal control over land, over people, over belief. This is where kingship begins, not with a crown, but with recognition. The first rulers did not need to explain why they ruled. The symbols already spoke for them. And once power is symbolized, it becomes difficult to challenge, because to challenge the ruler, you must challenge the meaning itself. This is the moment Egypt changes, when leadership becomes permanent, when authority becomes sacred, and when the pharaoh is finally named, he does not arrive as something new. He arrives as the living symbol of everything Egypt already believed. So here is where the story leaves us. Egypt did not rise suddenly. It was shaped by climate, by movement, by shared symbols. Long before the first pharaoh ruled, people were already thinking in Egyptian terms. They shared meanings. They recognized authority. They understood order. Which brings us to the real question. Did the pharaohs create Egypt? Or did Egypt create the pharaohs? Were kings the architects of civilization? Or were they the final result of beliefs that had already taken root in the minds of the people? When you look at the symbols, the burials, the shared imagery, it feels less like invention and more like inheritance. So tell us what you think. Do you believe Egypt was unified by power or by belief? And if symbols existed before kings, who truly ruled first? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because history is not only what is written, it is what we continue to question.